Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ryan Souza. I'm one of the senior investment managers here at Sharewise, and we're here this morning with Josh Puckridge. Now, Josh is the CEO of Earth Energy, listed on the ASX, and Josh is going to give us a brief overview of Earth Energy and see how we're going, and see how that industry is progressing and how the company is looking. And then we're going to open up the floor to a Q&A. So, Josh, thank you very much for your dedicated time and expertise here this morning. I'll hand it off to you for the presentation.
Thanks, Ryan. Thank you for having me. I've put together a bit of a different sort of new presentation. Confirming you guys can see that now, can you?
Yes.
Great. Let me just make that a bit bigger. Okay, so you've got that now?
We do. It's just in your presenter view.
Oh, right.
Digital slideshow.
Bear with me. Just do it like this then. Does that, so you're seeing that now? Yeah, sorry, apologies guys. That's a slight hiccup from using Zoom instead of Teams. But yeah, thanks for that, Ryan. So my name's Josh Puckridge. I've been running EE1 Earth Energy for the last just over 2 months now. EE1 listed earlier this year, at the start of this year, after conducting a reverse takeover from Cradle Resources, that was CXX. We raised $6 million, and we were able to acquire Australia's most advanced geothermal package, which represents over $40 million worth of expenditure from about 15 years ago, when geothermal had its first sort of big spotlight on the ASX and in Australia in general. And I've prepared today a more webinar sort of friendly presentation as opposed to the corporate presentation. But anyone who's on this, I'll make this particular slideshow available on our website at ee1.com.au. And I'll also, if anyone reaches out post this who would like a more formal corporate presentation or anything of the above, my emails are all there, and please don't hesitate to reach out. So what I'm doing just slightly differently here from the webinar format is we might just do a quick little geothermal basics, just to cater for really, each sort of end of the spectrum of just so we know what we're talking about when we talk about geothermal. So here on the left, you'll see my cursor there, is a traditional geothermal system. These are what's most readily found around the world. And it's usually pretty simple, and that's why they've been developed around the world so predominantly, about 90%. It's what we call a hydrothermal system. That's where we've identified somewhere in the subsurface, underground, hot water that's already there, likely under pressure, already circulating, already fluids there. And it becomes a really simple process of just plugging into that, extracting that hot water. We use that heat to generate electricity through a turbine. And then we pump that water back in where it hopefully heats up. And that's a really, really simple hydrothermal system. Those sorts of systems account for about 90% around the world. And geologically, the reason that those systems exist is typically because they're from millions and millions of years ago. They're former volcanic geological structures, so former volcanoes that have since lost their power, but they still have that remnant of hot liquid circulating in their subsurface. Australia, though, is obviously well known for having limited to no volcanic activity, but for maybe some of the sort of northern Queensland areas, and then obviously up into the Solomon Islands, we do have examples of decommissioned per se volcanoes that do have hot flowing waters. But in Australia, what we have is what we call a hot dry rock system. So that's where the rocks are there, they're hot. They're typically a little bit deeper than the hydrothermal systems, but they don't have their own circulating fluids. So they're there, they're hot, but it's not as simple as just tapping into that underground reservoir to extract the pressure, or rather to extract the heat with pressure. In this case, we actually have to introduce our own fluids, or our own geofluids, such that that heat can be brought to the surface to complete the same process as before, which is to use that heat to generate electricity. So you'll see here, this is again a simplified version of it. We have these hot systems down here, the hot dry rocks, but there's no water present like there was here in the traditional geothermal system, the hydrothermal system. So what we do there is we drill down and we introduce that water, and that water over time meets up with our production well. So we have an injection well and then a production well, and that water finds itself through the permeable rocks, the cracks in the rocks to connect up to that other side, and then the pressure builds and is relieved to the surface, where we're bringing to the surface heat and pressure, which, as we said earlier, is used to generate electricity that we can rely on once that's tapped into 24/7. So that's just a bit of a first order of principles of what, when I'm talking about geothermal, what it is. And the traditional system, the hydrothermal system, is a really simple one, the most common around the world. Not many, if any, of those in Australia. But what we do have a lot of, and quite big chunks of, which is why it's exciting to talk about the developments here in Australia, are the enhanced geothermal systems, where we introduce our own water and pull it up. Now, why hasn't that been developed more so to now? One, they're hard to find. Luckily at EE1, we've already found it and we have all the benefits of that. Two, they've been historically hard to engineer, but there's been about a 15-year sort of catch up over in the States since anyone in Australia was developing geothermal like we are now. And so that engineering hurdle has become far less of an issue, to the point now where we can start looking at the developments that have been made in the United States in particular, and bring those back to Australia, where we can implement a new strategy. So in terms of this slide here of just the key points that I want to get across in this webinar about EE1 and why it's, you know, a really interesting investment for anyone who's interested in a green power stock. You know, the sort of three key points here are: we're green baseload power. So baseload power is the sort of superior power to wind and solar. So wind and solar are intermittent. Obviously, they're only generating power when the wind blows and when the sun shines. Geothermal power, for the reasons I just sort of gave you, is perpetually tapped into that heat source and perpetually pumping and receiving geofluids to make electricity, regardless of the energy conditions. Oh, sorry, the weather conditions, or the other conditions affecting an otherwise intermittent source like wind and solar. So that's a big point. And obviously, when we look at any energy transition that the various grids are undertaking at the moment, having that backup to replace coal, well, in particular coal or battery systems, is quite important, because you need to base a system that can operate at night and can operate when the wind is low, and can operate on call as well when demand is high. Also, one thing that's historically kept geothermal back in Australia and lots of places around the world, not dissimilar to many natural resources projects, is when the resource can be, unfortunately, stranded. So when it's not near infrastructure, when it is, might have great geophysical characteristics, might be nice and hot, might be shallow, but if it's going to cost $1 billion to bring that online and put that power where it needs to be used, then it can be a non-starter. At EE1, we don't have that at all. We are sitting on the grid, and we're not just sitting on any grid. We're sitting on the South Australian grid that, once it's finally integrated, which is just about there, into the rest of the eastern seaboard, we're able to sell onto about 83% of Australia's electricity demand from site. That's something I'm not really aware of any other geothermal prospect in Australia being able to say, and it gives us a huge advantage, and really is one of the exciting points of the company. And then the third sort of key highlight here is that we have had the real benefit of being able to take the sort of jewels of the crown out of all of the interest and development that was made into geothermal sort of 15 years ago. So geothermal had a really interesting run between 2008 and 2011, where a lot of these systems, and I'll get through that in a little bit, But where essentially, for all the reasons I've discussed, geothermal was in vogue. It was understood that, okay, Australia doesn't have hydrothermal systems, but what if we're able to tap into these hot, dry rocks? And obviously that saw a flurry of investment into Australia's geothermal scene. And Australia, obviously, we're a rich exploring and mining nation. So we had great work done then. And the two main projects that we brought in South Australia being Paralana and our Flinders West project. They were two of the three best projects of that run, and combined had over $40 million spent on them. So, and we've been able to then just really pick those up where they were left off, and I'll run through what's sort of changed with that. But then on that sort of second point here is that what does that mean for us in practice in regards to that expenditure, and what valuations were met last time? Well, we hold two of the main projects from last time, Paralana and Flinders West, which is Blanche 1, held by Petrotherm and Greenrock at the time. And if we're just to retouch the valuations that were touched last time, that's an 11 to 13 time uplift from our current market valuations. So we know that we've got significant leverage here, and having only been in the role for about 2 months, I think I'm only just now at a position to be able to tell that story and to propose that sort of valuation prospect quite confidently to the market. So really, this is actually one of the first sort of broad presentations that I'm able to make, having been in the role for only 2 months, because we've really just now done the work to bring a lot of that in here. So you're sort of hearing this for the first time before this will, we think get picked up by a much sort of broader audience. And as I've said, 13 to 15 years since that last real run on geothermal. It didn't work in Australia at the time. It was largely due to engineering not being quite there for the heightened complexity of enhanced geothermal systems compared to the hydrothermal systems that I was referencing earlier. So because of that, we saw a typical overpromise, under-delivery of the promise of cheap and green energy here in Australia from geothermal. And that really, in conjunction with the GFC, in conjunction with any number of aspects around 2008 to 2011, we saw the Australian market totally disregard private investment in geothermal, but it wasn't disregarded around the world, and particularly in the United States, it's had a real refinement. So the projects we have now, we're looking at them in a really exciting way, because we know what's found, we know what we have there in terms of the natural resource, and we really get to apply 15 years worth of advancements to the space, which is just quite exciting, because the projects we have were never disregarded for any technical reasons. It was really that the engineering wasn't there, and it is there now. And a strong market. So based on how I said earlier that we're sitting there at 83% of on grid to 83% of Australia's electricity demand. We also announced just last week on the 15th of the month that we've had an independent review and market appraisal of what that means for us being able to connect to that aspect of the South Australian grid. And it's independently confirmed that we have above average pricing, quite exciting actually. Sort of selling into the wholesale market outside of a PPA, we're looking at $250 to $300 per megawatt hour, which is high. That's part of, because it's in the South Australian market, which has a bit of a pinch on it. It's also part of it being as a geothermal project, as baseload power that can be turned on at any time, 24/7. It also means that we can sell power during the day, or rather at night during hours of peak demand. So that's a huge benefit for us. We've also identified in that report, which I urge everyone to go and read. I haven't really added much of that into this presentation here, but subsequent ones will have that. But I have a look at that, because it goes through also how valuable it is to be on that part of the network, where we can also investigate in other power on demand options, which get get the sort of pricing up in the order of close to $1,000 per megawatt hour. So we're in a bit like how I said earlier, there's no point having a great project if it's not on a grid. We're not just on any grid, we're on a really lucrative grid. So again, very high level, robust tick for our future prospectivity and development. And then what I'm really proud to say is as well that we've got, as a smaller ASX company with big projects, we've also got the right team in place, which I'm very proud to say, having worked in geothermal for a number of years now. It's not as easy as it sounds to find the right groups. They're in high demand. They don't want to put their names to projects that don't have a high chance of success. So having Baker Hughes and GLJ, who are both the American and Canadian groups who are really at the forefront of geothermal. GLJ has largely had a lot to do with Vulcan Energy and their success. What we really like about GLJ is they're a project integrator as well as being geothermal experts. They're also experts in CCS and CCUS. And we also see that as a potential down the road value add based on how other things pan out. And then Baker Hughes are obviously a huge American engineering and energy firm. They have been at the forefront of geothermal drilling and project design for some time now. And we have them over working with us on the basis of their view of our project being a realistic project to go into development, which is might not sound very impressive, but is not an easy thing to get groups like that to put their name to projects like ours. Well, ours are quite good, so it is, but not everyone can say that, but we can. So moving on. So why are we the most advanced? So these are the projects I was referencing before. So Paralana over here is probably our most advanced and most exciting project. It was drilled historically to over 4 kilometers depth, which even by today's standards is no easy feat, certainly not a cheap feat either. So when you hear me say things like we are advanced, but also we get the benefit of that $40 million worth of expenditure. About half of that has really gone into Paralana. So where other groups might be talking about all around the world about heats, they're usually inferred heats. It's quite unique for a company to say we've actually drilled it and we know what's down there. We know the petrophysics of it all. We know the heat. Those projects were actually, and I'll talk about this shortly, but those projects were also piloted. So we actually know to the degree which they already work. And we also know why they weren't progressed any further. So why are we the most advanced? Well, we're actually one of the few EGS targets in the world that's actually been drilled, and we know that the heat's there. Not everyone can say that. So again, quite advanced. And then the Flinders West corridor here, up towards the top there is Olympic Dam. That was run by Greenrock back in the day. That was drilled to about 2 kilometers depth and about the same gradients, so about the same heat for that average depth compared to Paralana. Very long strike here. So whilst this over here at Paralana is most likely going to be a high yielding, big company making project, hopefully, here at Flinders West, we have elements of that, but we also have these longer strikes where we can put in longer strike projects, which might not be as hot and as high yielding, but can be just as big with the right engineering. And we'll talk about that in a second. So why we're the most advanced, I'm not aware of anyone else in Australia other than one project that's no longer with us that can say it's drilled and tested to over 4 kilometers depth. It's been piloted. So when we're talking about what we're doing, we're talking about it from a perspective of already having that data in our own hands and from a far more de-risk point of view than other earlier stage projects that would be 2 to 3 years away from replicating where we've gotten to. As I said there. So this is just a further little zoom in on Paralana, which I'll use as a bit of a talking point to get across sort of what our next steps are. because it's a simple one to talk about. Like I say, it's already drilled. We know a lot about it. So we're going along with that at the moment, and no, it doesn't do it. No. So we're sorry about that. So we are sorry about that. I just lost my shot. But the Paralana project is drilled and tested. It's close to infrastructure, which we already know, and we have already used that as the sort of as the main piece to look at it in comparison to how we would we've used that as a case study per se for more advanced groups like Fervo Energy in Houston at the moment, and others who have who are probably a few steps ahead of us, and how we can in practice apply that new age American engineering that's been developed whilst Australia hasn't been developing geothermal. And so we've sort of used that as a case study for how we can apply those standards and techniques. And really the main thing that comes down to is on this following slide here, which is a really simple way of showing that the Paralana over here on this side. So I hope this sort of comes through, but this is how it was. This is how it was drilled and tested previously. So a very simple injection well and a production well here, and you've got one connecting zone. So you notice that these have just been drilled vertically. So that's just where it's just coming down straight. So it's found a reservoir here, which is represented by this thermal conductive zone here. And then we inject into that and we pump water, and we hope that that water, well, back then they hoped that that water would find its way to the production well, where that pressure is then relieved to the surface. So that's how it was done historically. When it was done historically, that was self-pumping. So when that's just the water's been put down, it's connected to the other side from the injection well to the production well. That managed to flow itself. So just using the heat in the reservoir and the pressure in the reservoir, that was able to pump itself in the order of 6 liters a second to the surface. That's not too bad for a self-pumping number. Then when it was pumped, it got to about 20 liters a second. Again, not bad, and not bad for a first pass, for a first pilot. But typically we look for about 60 liters a second. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, when that was done rather by previous operators in 2008 to 2011, those numbers were encouraging. And they were actually really good as a first stage pilot. Like I say, also by using this relatively crude at the time vertical drilling and vertical stimulation method. But at the time as well, it was the peak of the GFC, and there was also another company called Geodynamics who had sort of like the one project ahead of this one at the time, called Habanero. That basically around the time that this was happening, that project was found to be essentially not be able to be developed for other reasons that we won't get into. But sort of that hurt the space of geothermal at the time. And then that combined with the GFC really meant that where all things being equal, that would have been great first results, and they would have gone into the second stage of exploration and piloting. But the market wasn't exactly there for it. Also because of the GFC at the time, a South Australian regulator basically said to lots of companies similar to Petrotherm at the time that they had to increase their balance sheets, their capital adequacy to keep wells and projects like this underway, because during the GFC there was a genuine fear that companies like this one would go broke essentially, and then the state would have been left with a large a large rehabilitation liability to that the companies couldn't actually rehabilitate and manage on their own right. So what happened was Petrotherm were given, I think it was 9 months, maybe 12, to raise. I think it was like $12 million in the sort of the absolute depths of the GFC, and they just couldn't. So they had to then plug and abandon the hole. So when it was left that way, it wasn't left because it was not a good project, because it didn't give the results that led to the next steps. It really was a victim of a few other external circumstances. And also, it's good to remember around 2011 is when Australia also went into a real love affair with cheap thermal coal. So geothermal was fighting a lot of battles at the time, and as was Petrotherm on this project, and that's really why and where it was left. So that was then. How do we look at it now? So when you've heard me talk about the developments that have been made in the United States and the engineering developments and how that all works, how it's rather not how that all works, but rather how that is an advantage to us. We see here in diagram 2 on the right side here, you can see here that it is that we can instead look at this as a horizontal interaction. So where that reservoir is sitting there, we can instead go in either under it or through it. And you can see here by the extra rectangles here that are meant to represent those conductive zones, that same sized injection and production well now has access to quite a lot more surface area where it's interacting with the heat and the pressure of the reservoir. And that heat and pressure can be amplified up and down that exact same size of hole. And that's essentially one of the, it's not as simple as that, but it is well and truly one of the more simple ways of putting, what are we doing differently this time, and evaluating Paralana in the context of being horizontally drilled, well and truly should get it to a point of being or increasing those flow rates. We already know it's hot. So it's really just a matter now of which we're underway with, of assessing those developments and how particularly that concept of horizontal drilling can be implemented into our projects such that we can pick up where it was left off 15 years ago. So that sort of leads us to this concept here of what our energy density is and how do we stack up around the world. I won't spend too much time on this slide because it's a little esoteric, but happy to field any questions on it later or by email if anyone wants to get back to me. But the point of this is to show that basically the higher the better, and these are the ranges here of our 2 projects in these rectangles, and these bigger sort of circles around here represent operating projects around the world, and the power that we have based on work that's already been done, based on the engineering developments that have been made around the world, are well and truly capable of putting us in multi-hundred megawatt project capacities. So again, something maybe best digested with it in front of you as opposed to from myself. But we have done the work and we have established that these projects are significant and world-class. With or even at the starting point of what was done last time, they still fit within a round of feasible projects, but particularly with the developments, for the reasons I've spoken about, they have significant upside to be better than they were assessed to be in the last round. And that's what I get to here. Just a quick one on so when I now talk about the sort of what's happening and how we stack up on a valuation point of view, I'll quickly talk about our board. Very happy we've got Grant Davey as our executive chairman. Grant's had any number of successes in the energy space. Currently serves as an executive director of Lotus Minerals, a Malawian uranium company, and also Frontier Energy, FHE on the ASX. You'll see that that's doing quite well today, and they're really leading the charge here in Western Australia with solar and battery solutions onto the grid. So we're very lucky to have Grant there as not just an executive chairman, but also as one of our major shareholders. And then also Chris is our executive director, also has a long career in the energy sector, and David Wheeler as well, who's a well-known Perth director, and myself there, who, as I said, I've started this role about 2 months ago, and coming out of another company, Steam Resources, for geothermal, which again, geothermal just coming back to the ASX and to Australia now after a big hiatus, really means that I'm one of the few people that have sort of been working in the space recently in this sort of capacity, in this corporate capacity. So again, it's a good marriage with EE1. And here again, I urge you to look at this with the benefit of it in front of you. But you know, we're a pretty humble enterprise valuation at the moment of about 7.1 million, or a 12 mil market cap. That is really on the basis of, like I said, it's taken about 2 months to get everything underway. We're just at that position now where I can start talking quite assertively about the value proposition and what's to be done next. And that gets us into some of the statements I made earlier about what's the real upside of EE1 where we currently stand. So here in the middle with the darker shading here, these represent the sort of four large companies out of the last geothermal run between 2008 and 2011. And at their peaks, you can see, so here's Petrotherm. So Petrotherm had our Paralana project, and that was its only geothermal project. So it was getting all of that value at its peak. It was 11 times what we are today at EE1. And then Greenrock has Blanche 1, the Flinders West project on that western corner there. They were about 2.5 times our valuation. So combined, we're 11 to 13.5 times valuations. If we're to retrace the values that were set in the last run, for all the reasons I've discussed today already, there's a strong argument to say that we should be exceeding those valuations. Also remembering that those valuations were on the basis of explorers. We're post-exploration. We have a known resource that we're working through now. We're lower risk and higher outcome on the basis of that new engineering. So really, I'm happy to run with that sort of 11 times uplift potential, because if anything, it should be higher. And then over here to our right, just to show sort of the valuations that are being pushed in the space. Fervo there on the left, these are both Northern American companies. But Fervo Energy is probably leading the charge. They have 2 projects similar to us. What they've done differently is that they're privately funded thus far, and I think they're IPOing in the US. Well, I think they will be. I actually don't know that for sure, but they are progressing, and they are progressing the EGS project design, which we've spoken about here, which is very similar. Their project is very similar to ours, both in geology and also in geology and in potential size. And Fervo is a really good example of the valuations that are being credited around the world at the moment in geothermal. And we're of the belief that that's realistic for us as well, albeit with a few next steps taking place. And so then we will go to this, and I'll start to sort of wind up now so we can get into some questions. But just back to my earlier comments about being able to assemble like the right team. Baker Hughes, world-renowned, one of the biggest engineering companies in the world for energy. They've also developed their own particular drilling styles for geothermal, which we're lucky to have access to. Again, they don't really lend their brand to many people, so it's an endorsement of the quality of our projects and the quality of our strategy that they've lent us their name. And then similar to GLJ, so GLJ most recently have been credited with part of the success of the Vulcan Energy story, and what they've been able to do there for Vulcan, or with Vulcan rather, is really impressive. And like I say, one of the reasons that we're really excited to work with them is not just because of their long and excellent sort of track record and street credit with geothermal, but also their flexibility for a bigger firm, their flexibility around project integration. So obviously in the case of Vulcan, it was integrating lithium brine extraction For us, it might be something else. It might be something along the CCS play or the CCUS play, or it might be integrating a storage solution like has been looked at around the world. So again, having a big, well-resourced group that's again wouldn't otherwise put their name to us if they hadn't endorsed the projects for the same reasons that we like them. And then JRG, whilst we still don't have really much of a subsurface team on staff, so we've been using the JRG group, which is a global group, but they do actually have feet in the ground here in Perth, which makes things a bit easier. And they are from that geoscience point of view than that engineering point of view. They've been incredibly helpful and have really let us build models from scratch that we otherwise wouldn't have. So really what this slide's meant to impress is that, it's not just me and a select team here. We have a well and truly global reach of bringing in that engineering, because, part of what I've been saying here is that development has gone offshore and only just come back. And, this is a sort of testament to how we have access to it, which without those sort of contacts would be, quite laborious and wouldn't result in the timely development of a project. So having assembled this team already really means that once we get on to next steps, we will be able to execute quite quickly. So that's really where I'd like to leave it for us today, guys, for the sort of formal presentation. I'm sure there'll be some questions on the next, but like I say, that's sort of a different presentation, more to try and cater to the webinar format. But yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Josh. Really appreciate the overall update on the market and how geothermal is progressing holistically. So I've got a couple of questions here. We'll just start us off with which are fairly broad focused, and then we'll drill down more focused on the EE1. Again, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions you'd like to submit, please submit them through the Q&A function on Zoom. Now, just to start things off, realistically, obviously, you've discussed the engineering updates or the engineering changes that have come out of the US. The first question we've got submitted is, why will your project technically succeed when all others historically have failed or struggled?
Yep. No, good question. So like I said earlier, our Paralana project, which is probably our flagship project in many respects, it never really failed. It really was a victim of the GFC, which I know it sounds like a bit of a soft excuse, but it was a success of exploration. So it was found, and obviously that would have been that was a $20 odd million point of expenditure for its previous operators. We don't have that. We get to step in with the benefit of 15 years of geothermal refinement. So really for us, we know what's there to a large degree. We are able to talk to groups such as Baker Hughes, such as GLJ, and a few others that I can't name at this point, but a few other high-profile Houston groups who are actually doing this now. So we now have in geothermal, we have far more data points. So to talk a bit more broadly about what's changed in geothermal, the quality of seismic data and its interpretation and our ability to actually map a subsurface is just chalk and cheese compared to what it was 15 years ago. So we really now, we have a much better, a much more granular and a much more high resolution understanding of what's happening in the subsurface and how to interact with it. Also, we look at like horizontal drilling, which I've gone through, and the benefits of that, interacting with that reservoir, that heat with more surface area contact makes for more heat, more pressure to the surface, and drilling with greater accuracy. So even back then, it's interesting to note that back when they were drilling, 4 kilometre deep holes, they were still sort of doing a bit of crossing the fingers that the targeting was accurate. So we don't have that now. So if we have those big sort of, drilling campaigns, we pretty much, the drilling, I don't think it's quite as simple as me saying this, but it is a good soundbite. The drilling is almost a formality these days. We don't see the targeting errors, and we do see the far better resolution understanding of the subsurface that we didn't have 15 years ago.
Okay. Well, thank you for the update in that regard. Now, just moving on, obviously, a participant stated that EGS has a risk of induced seismicity. Has the risk been assessed for intended projects and what mitigants are being proposed?
Sorry, could you just say that one again? You broke up there.
So, EGS has a risk of induced seismicity. Has this risk been assessed for intended projects and what mitigants are being proposed?
Yeah. So the induced seismicity and fracturing. So yeah, so when we will re-enter those holes, we now use a far more complex system than was used sort of 15 years ago. So we use fiber optic. So we actually and this is part of what Fervo. So when you hear me reference Fervo, they are all oil and gas guys that have brought sort of like the last 30 years of oil and gas into geothermal. And basically, we can monitor the fracturing and the seismic activity in real time, whilst that overpressuring is occurring. So it's something we're very mindful of. Something that should be noted though is that where that's occurred in other jurisdictions of the obviously is associated with geothermal EGS fracking and its effects on subsurface. One of the advantages I referenced earlier in this piece was how Australia is known for its stable geology. We don't have as many complexities as other projects in that regard. But like I say, the ability to monitor fracking in real time is really the major mitigator of that these days.
Okay, well, thank you for that one. Just to bring the focus back to EE1 before I pass it over to some of the participant questions. Obviously, you guys have a couple of core projects. Realistically, when do you expect to receive first revenue from operations?
Yeah, so if we look at what's happening around the world, look at the Fervo's Red project and Fervo's Cape Station project. 2 years in from where we sit now to 2 years ahead, they were able to lock in a PPA with one of the largest, well, the largest in geothermal history. But I think it was over $400 million in Nevada. So point being, it's realistic within 2 years.
Okay. Thank you for that update. Now we'll just move to some of the live submitted questions here. This one asks, do you plan to drill shallower than Evor's loops? Are you more dependent on sites than their tech?
Great question. Yeah, so as I've sort of said earlier, one of the great benefits of EE1 is that we've got the advantage of all of that exploration and development that was done 15 years ago, and that $40 million that's been spent. So we're actually, and we've announced this to the market, we're actually underway with what's called a techno-economic review. And that's done by the GLJ guys, who are, in my opinion, best at the field at this. And it's literally what they're doing like it's probably a bit more than a scoping study, a little bit less than a feasibility study, but looking at, okay, what's the best hardware around the world? What's the best tech? And that includes Evor, that includes Fervo. And how does that apply to not just Australia or not just our projects in general, but to specific locations of our projects where we've got specific and explicit geophysical data. So it answers that question of, is it more about, I always like to say that geothermal, one of the many eclectic and sort of value-adding things from geothermal is that at every juncture in the development cycle, it's not like hard rock mining or gold mining or coal mining, where you sort of hand it over from the exploration, the geophysical and the exploration side to the mining side and the development side. You're sort of running both at tandem. So you're in a constant state of better understanding the geophysics of the project and understanding what the current state of hardware is, and the current state of the actual engineering practices are, to know how much you can sort of squeeze out of those geophysical properties. So that is a constant concept that we reevaluate at really all development points along the development cycle. So it's always both is the answer.
Okay. Well, thank you for the mark up in that one. Now, A different participant submits, you mentioned how much you're expecting to receive in revenue per megawatt hour, but at what cost as compared to other alternatives? For example, will the plant be competitive when compared to nuclear?
Yeah, great question. We sort of already know this answer. So the levelized cost of energy, we know in geothermal, particularly once it's past the exploration stage, is one of the lowest. It's one of the lowest for lots of different reasons. But part of that work that I just referenced, earlier with what we're doing with GLJ, we're going to have some specific data on that that's been independently prepared for our projects, not just holistically. But we do know that, again, once post that exploration phase, once the geothermal resource is found and it's found to be big enough, which we have, the actual cost of bringing that online is very competitive, arguably more competitive than nuclear, particularly more competitive than nuclear when nuclear is properly costed in for the decommissioning phases. Another big, really important thing to understand with geothermal is that geothermal has the lowest environmental footprint. So, 100 megawatt geothermal power plant takes up about the size of a 3x2 home. It's quite small. We also have, we have these long life, or these long commission life ranges as well. So we'll see, 15 years would be considered a pretty average and short lifespan. We're really talking 20, 25 to 30 years, and up to 45 in some cases. So we have a lot of economics in our favour once you get past that exploration phase, which we have.
Okay, now keeping on the topic of the economics, realistically, what scale of investment is going to be required to drill out to production? And realistically, when it comes to raising that, do you have plans on whether to raise that on market or through other means?
Great question. So that's when it comes to the scale of investment. We're working through that now, and it's a really hard thing to. And I'm not certainly in no way avoiding the question, but it really comes down to that's how we know if we've got a great project or a really great project. Is our ability to optimize those costs to obviously to the lower side for the same output. And that comes down to a lot of factors. It comes down to well spacing, how big the well field is. Obviously, if we can have a 10 megawatt well versus a 5 megawatt well, then we might need half as many wells. That was sort of part of that slide I showed earlier, showing the power density. So the higher we get that density, the fewer wells that we need. And so when we talk about so in answer to the question of what's a realistic number, we know that we have to come in at a payback period that makes sense. We know that we have to come in at an IRR that makes sense to get the market going. So that will be what it will be, and we'll only obviously commission something, and we're very confident that we can. But we're still working through that, and that's going to be one of the exciting things that the market will learn hopefully this year. And then second to that, on how we would finance that, these projects, because they're so reliable, because they're so long dated, these projects lend themselves really well to debt financing and at a project level. And you'll actually notice there are very few, most geothermal projects around the world are owned privately by pension funds, particularly there's the name escapes me, but there's one large Canadian pension fund that just owns like a ton of them, owns about 50% of the market is owned by this one Canadian group. And for that very reason, because once they're done, they're very reliable. So we have lots of different avenues to do that very creatively. Leaning off of, like I say, really reliable projects that lend themselves to that. And look, we're at the end of the day, we're corporate guys. We're all in there as shareholders of EE1. We want to see that done off balance sheet such that we get the maximum leverage into the share price of EE1.
Okay, well, appreciate the update there. Now, is steam resource geothermal average to be integrated into EE1?
No, so Steam, just if that wasn't covered earlier, so Steam Resources was a company that I founded in around 2020. And that is a great company. It's still private, but hosts one of the world's largest geothermal exploration packages. including the entirety of the Beetaloo Basin, which is quite an achievement, and a smaller project here in WA, and then some other large tracts in South Australia. It has a very different style to EE1. EE1 is by far ahead of it in terms of the development cycle. There is always the potential to bring them together. There's certainly synergies of doing so. However, at this point, I think we owe it to the shareholders of EE1 to really focus on Paralana and Flinders West, because for all the reasons I've said in this presentation, they're quite advanced, and they really do have the potential to bring that entire sort of flurry of interest and investment back into Australia's geothermal space.
Okay, well, thank you for the clarification. Just one more to finish us off today. Has there been any modelling done to show that the initial design of the current producer well will sustain intended increments of the multi-injection?
We're doing that now. So we're doing that now. We actually share an office with, I won't name them, but we share an office with a kind of like the micro mine of subsurface modelling, and we are doing that now. Our understanding is that it should, but we're doing our best to be able to model that with some pretty integrated solutions at the moment to have some, I would say, have some assumptions that are put into a model that can confirm that a little bit more. But we're running under the assumption, and we think it's a pretty robust one, that yes, they will.
Okay, well, thank you for that update. Now, just before we leave everyone, Josh, is there anything you'd like to finish off with? No,
just that it's a really exciting space, heaps to come. Every day we're finding out something that sort of either de-risks it or ups the potential return. It's great to get involved now whilst we're still sort of, I'd say, dealing with the current share price just being, I wouldn't say even depressed, just unseen. So this really represents the first bit of broad marketing that I've done, and I think it makes sense to get involved now, just simply on the basis that the more I tell the story, in conjunction with the more work that I do. But we really are we're a bit of a no-brainer when it comes to that, with an 11 times uplift, and I think we've tested our lows. So I think we operate as a good investment on anyone's portfolio as a green baseload power producer. So yeah, look, I think we're great, and would thank you everyone for their time for jumping on this, and would love to see people get involved, and feel free to get in touch with me through our website or my email, or however you get to me. You're more than welcome to, because yeah, I love telling the story, and there's plenty more to tell.
Well, Josh, thank you very much for your time and expertise today, and ladies and gentlemen, enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers.
Thanks, Ryan.